Okay, so let me start giving introductions of who are presenting tonight. We have Shreya, Neo, and Parth from NLP-SPY team. So this is a core data science project that I took over from other advisor from computer science department. And then over the last semester, or I would say term, the spring term, with this amazing group of individuals, we could modify the original project to be more application-based projects. So I don't want to spoil much of the hard work that they did. So if you are ready, go ahead and start your presentation.
I think were we expecting another presenter to go first, or was it our group first? Not entirely sure.
I think
you guys can go first, Sahar. Yeah, you guys can go first. I have a presenter later on.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Give me a moment to share my screen. All right. Hello, everyone. So we are, thank you for the introduction, first of all, Sahar. We are the NLP-SPY team. My name is Neo Sood. My teammates are Shreya U and Parth Sharma. And today we will be presenting on steps towards developing NLP-based software associated with open source Raspberry Pi hardware. And before we begin, I'd just like to say some of the terms we do use in this presentation are pretty technical and might be foreign to some people who aren't very familiar with data science. So towards the end of our presentation, we'd love if you could just keep note of your feedback and ask us any questions you have at all, like we do for every presentation. But I just wanted to make that disclaimer first. Okay, so we'll start off by going over the introduction. We'll then go into some, dive into some history and the origins of NLP. We'll then talk about NLP applications and specifically how it applies to COVID-19, as well as military and robotics. We'll then go into some more core NLP concepts like tokenization, Unicode and graph theory as well, and Zipf's law and named entity recognition. And finally, we'll talk about natural language processing versus neurolinguistic programming, which is something we've been dabbling in more recently. Okay.
Okay, so I'll start off by explaining what NLP is because it's a core part of our project. NLP is essentially a way for computers to understand language, human language, and have a two-sided conversation with humans. It came about due to the increasing demands of the internet and the World Wide Web. So NLP is actually present in pretty much everyday life. Like if you have a Google Home or Alexa in your house, you know NLP, you've seen it, speech recognition and voice recognition. Grammar and spell checks also use NLP like Grammarly, and voice typing and bot communication also use NLP. NLP is used in many fields like linguistics, psychology, robotics, and even the military.
Hi, my name is Shreya U, and now I'm going to be talking about the origin of NLP. So NLP originates during the 9th century and was invented by Arab cryptographer Al-Kindi. And essentially what he did was he created the theoretical foundations of machine translation. And he had 4 pillars for his system of translation, which include frequency, probability, statistical analysis, and cryptanalysis, which are still prevalent in machine learning today. About 8 centuries later, in the 17th century, Descartes, who's a famous mathematician, developed Esperanto, which is an international synthetic language. And this also furthered international peace and understanding. And finally, NLP was also used extensively during World War II throughout the 1940s in order to communicate and decipher secret codes. It was also used heavily during the Cold War when the United States worked to translate the Russian language, and also with espionage, where the government attempted to gain political and military information from other countries. And past the 2000s, when technology was becoming more prevalent in society, scientists began to discover, specifically in 2013, word embedding, which helped them develop methods to correlate words and phrases. So as you can see, the graph on the right depicts the TSNE visualization of book embeddings. So TSNE stands for T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding. And at the right, it shows a column of book genres such as crime, science fiction, and much more. The x-axis and y-axis show TSNE 1 and 2, which shows that this is a two-dimensional visualization. The graph correlates the age group targeted to a certain genre and the ratings to predict the next occurrence of a best-selling book of a particular genre. So now I'm going to be talking about NLP and sentiment analysis and its application with COVID-19 and our research of the analysis of tweets. So we did a little bit of sentiment analysis research, and in local times, society has expressed feelings and moods via posts on social media, and specifically people have posted.
She's like a 4, maybe 3, but she has an ass.
I think somebody is talking.
You're right. All right, so she's a 7, but wears a crap ton of makeup. Oh no, 0, 3. That shit's bad.
Okay, that's great. Okay, they muted themselves. Okay, as I was saying, we were able to conduct sentiment analysis research. And in recent years, scientists have been able to monitor society's expression of feelings and moods via what they post on social media, specifically on Twitter, with regards to recent events and pandemic. And they used BERT, or essentially bidirectional encoder representations from transformers, in order to be able to detect the fear aspect throughout different countries' Twitter bases. And they also used long short-term memory, LSTM, and recurrent neural networks such as RNN. So if I were to just explain this little picture, you can see that it's essentially the methodological framework of their algorithm. So it has 3 parts, A, B, and C. So the general area of A, you can see some lockdown phases, some unlock phases, and keywords. That's when the tweets are initially passed. And then this is where the algorithm does some data collection and pre-processing. And it puts it through some embedding layers and some other layers. And then you go on to step B, which is essentially more the model development. It really starts to analyze the data and put them into point format. And then finally in C, it's able to plot these points onto a graph map-like format, and it's able to classify whether the sentiment is negative, which is shown in red at the bottom in the map, or positive, which is shown in green. And this particular thing is for the Indian Twitter base. And overall, they were able to conduct the spatio-temporal analysis of predicted sentiment of geotagged tweets. And just to go into more as to what that means, so geotag COVID-19 tweets. So scientists were able to narrow down the top 40 hashtags that were used in COVID-19 during the COVID-19 pandemic in Twitter in a specific Indian community. And as you can see, the hashtags are as follows, like COVID-19, coronavirus, etc. The weighted in degree shows how many times they appear in one traversal of the algorithm. So in this case, COVID-19 appeared about 31,000 times. And the closer the C to the power of A value is to 0, the more prevalent it is and the more fear was displayed in that particular area. And some of them, as you can see, show 4 and 3, so they're quite farther away. And on the right side is a sentiment map that the scientists put together as a distribution of tweets. So top 7, we have United States in the first. Essentially at the rightmost, they show the number of tweets, and the percentage is the number of tweets that display the fear aspect. And so there are fear, 43%, about 43% for the United States, that shows the fear sentiment, and 15% for the United Kingdom, and so on. And now just to discuss the NLP aspect as I was talking about before. So scientists were able to use word embedding, which helped them to be able to detect most of these sentiments through grouping of related words. They also use the continuous bag of words formula, or the CBOW, to demonstrate a unique distribution of these repeated words. And just to show you a simple example as to what that actually means, if you take a look at the picture on the right, you can see I, like, natural, and then processing are all context words. And so once the algorithm traverses through several articles online, the most common word that comes in between natural and processing is the word language. And so that's really what this continuous bag of words example is. And so language is what goes in between. And so by doing that, they were able to find some common sentiments, which include optimism at some points, like positivity, and also some annoyances, fear, obviously, and then there were some jokes and sarcasm. And they were able to find the overall direct relationship between the number of COVID cases and the expressed fear in a certain area, and able to predict and take action towards the rising of mental health issues in teens. And here's the drawback of NLP. It's with regards to humor and sarcasm. So a lot of machines often falsely detect one sentiment over the actual metaphorical and sarcastic meaning. So scientists are still working towards fixing that error and figuring out how a machine can overcome that. And so now we'll go into more military applications, both practical and wartime. So NLP can help the military people automatically detect relationships between entities that are gathered from the data. And this includes pattern recognition, analysis, and even exploitation of their targets. It also helps them extract specific attributes or people and machinery, including hair color, nationality, and even the model of specific artillery. And they're also able to predict military officer promotions by drawing conclusions from writing assessments. So these written assessments that the commanders leave, they're able to predict the readiness of military units and organizations. And they also utilize encoding and decoding. So an encoder turns the text into numerical representation or a vector form, and then the decoder unravels these encoded words from that vector, and then they return text, tags, labels, or even sentiments, and they both require hidden state output and previous state, unlike the encoder. So just to break that down in terms of the photo, you can see that at the top, they pass in some Chinese characters, and it goes into the purple squares, which essentially is the encoder turning it into a vector form. And then it gets decoded by the decoder at the bottom into English. And you can see that the Chinese characters translate into this English sentence, and that's essentially how a translator works. And so now we'll be talking about some robotics applications. So applications in robotics. So NLP is used often to improve human-robot interaction. And so these social robots, such as the one that you see at the right, are programmed now using NLP in order to detect the human's emotions and arousal. And this is by analyzing your face and posture. So scientists are now designing actions and reactions of these robots by essentially combining the semantic information of the emotions that you're portraying with other ideal tasks in machinery. And this essentially helps the robot adapt into ideal surroundings and to make it very homey for you as a person. And these surroundings sort of include restaurants, hotels, hospitals, airports, and even museums. So one thing that the robot can do is track your eye movement. And as I said, eye movement and dilation of your pupils are two main things that your eye tracker does. So the eye movements include fixations and saccades. So fixations are slightly longer than saccades. Fixations are about 50 to 600 milliseconds, and then saccades are about 20 to 40 milliseconds. So the two main movements are performed by our eyes when we look at a static image with a relatively fictionary head. So when we're fixating our gaze at a certain direction, that's called a fixation. And so our eyes will remain still for a small particular period of time. And as you can see at the image on the right, it's sort of like a dot. Your eyes are fixating at a certain point. And a saccade is a rapid eye movement from one place to another, and that depicts more as a line in this raw eye tracker data at the right. And as I mentioned, eye trackers also work towards measuring the diameter of the pupil and correlating that with valence and arousal. So essentially what it does is after measuring the diameter of the pupil, it's able to categorize your mood into 3 different categories, either positive, negative, or neutral. And this valence scale is between 1 through 9, 1 meaning very unpleasant and it has a low valence, to a 9 being a very pleasant vibe, and a high valence. So scientists were able to classify your arousal into 3 different classes. Class 1, meaning it's very pleasant, and as you can see, it has a valence of close to 9, which means it's high valence and also high arousal. Class 2 is more neutral, meaning that it has a very middle valence, so it's in the middle of the valence scale, and it also has very low arousal, so it's low stimulating. And finally, class 3 is high arousal, meaning that you have strong negative feelings towards whatever you're looking at. However, you have low valence, meaning that you have very less interest in it. So essentially, when you put eye tracking together into a robot, how does it work? So in order to be able to analyze your visual perception and your emotional response to the robot, it has to measure some physiological aspects. So EEG, eye tracking, and heart rate are some things that has to get done. EEG essentially stands for electroencephalogram, which measures your brain. Eye tracking measures your eyes, and then heart rate obviously measures your heart rate. So the measuring device are the EEG wireless, the eye tracker, and some sort of pulse sensor in order to detect your BPM. The data that it collects are EEG signals from 14 different channels. So it's this electric signals from 14 different channels of your brain, your point of gaze, so what direction you're actually looking at, and then the time interval between consecutive pulses of your heart. And finally, to analyze this data, for the brain, it calculates the power spectrum density, which is with the saccade and fixation magnitude durations and the beats per minute that it calculates, it's finally able to put together your valence arousal numbers on the scales and able to plot it on a point.
Okay, thank you, Shreya. So next, I'll be talking more about the technical aspects of NLP, and we're going to start with the first step in NLP analysis, which is tokenization. So to introduce tokenization, it's essentially when you split up a text into different tokens, which are usually in the form of words, but can also be in the form of phrases, as I'll discuss in further slides. But one idea that you might come up with instantly is, why not just use white space? Well, as you see here, it seems to work well as we tokenize this simple phrase into 5 different tokens just based on white space. But when we have unique punctuation, innuendo or double meaning, and other literary variables, this approach seems to fall off very fast and becomes very limited. So that's why in NLP, focusing on tokenization is actually very important. And to discuss some of the failures of white space, just as an example, we have this phrase, go make the bed. And we can either split it up into 4 different tokens, like the blue example, or 2 tokens, like the red example. And as you can see, if this were to be processed by a computer, these 2 different tokenizations would have very different meanings. And that's why this is kind of just a good example as to why we need to distinguish between just white space and actually like real phrases when we're trying to understand sentiment behind text. And so based on this, another example is actually foreign languages, where you can't rely on words or space to indicate meaning. And so these languages become unparsable with just white space. So there's a clear need to define what a token is in the context of NLP. So then we go to lexicography to find this meaning. And we find that significant collocations are very important in this process. And what significant collocations are words that appear beside each other often enough such that their meaning becomes fixed. Well, this is kind of like the make the bed example, where the meaning of make changes when it's seen next to the word bed. And so we interpret that as a different meaning when we're processing that kind of phrase. But even though significant collocations help a lot, homographs and compounds complicate things. So just to take you all back to 2nd grade real quick, we can see in the first diagram, we have this word saw. Well, depending on what kind of person you are or what your profession is, you might see this as an actual physical saw, or as like the verb saw, where you just look at something. Same thing with bark and bat. And yeah, so these kind of homographs really are difficult for computers to interpret without looking at context, which is why we need to focus on them. Same thing with jellyfish, right? I don't think I need to explain that. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And we can see that word recognition can be achievable through these collocations rather than just looking at words based on their white space and based on their separation by white space and just the raw word, it's important to consider context. And this means we can look at NLP through more of a common sense approach rather than just mechanical. So next, I'd like to discuss another core aspect of NLP, which is decoding and encoding, which Shreya brought up earlier. And this ultimately culminates in Unicode, which is very important. So to discuss something before I talk about Unicode, we'll talk about how characters and letters were represented by machines before. So there actually used to be hundreds of different systems to represent characters in the forms of ones and zeros, as you can see in this diagram. This is the ASCII table, which is the American standard for computation, for primitive computations. And this was made during the 1960s up until 1991 when Unicode was established. So now we'll talk about Unicode. So Unicode is kind of exactly what it looks like based on this picture. It's just a system of numbers accepted by programmers around the world to represent characters in most languages. It's used in all things relating to language and computers, especially in the 21st century. And it's maintained by one organization, the Unicode Consortium, and it updates every few years so that, you know, things stay current and programmers don't get confused by different versions of Unicode. So now to discuss decoding versus encoding. The way I like to put it is that decoding is kind of like unwrapping a package, and encoding is like packing a package up and sending it. So what this means, decoding is interpreting an encoded message where the input is binary data that represents the message and the output is decoded data, which represents what we're trying to understand. This is done by microprocessors and microprocessors and memory cards in today's day and age. And encoding is kind of the opposite. It's creating a message and turning it into ones and zeros that can be understood by computers when the message is sent. So next we'll talk about graph theory as it relates to NLP. So to define graphs in a data science context rather than a mathematical one, graphs are a collection of nodes and edges. So as you can see in this image, we have 5 different nodes, which are different cities, and they're all connected by these different edges. So when you think of a graph, think more of this. And if you're a chemistry person, then you can look at molecules and you can interpret that as a graph. And these edges can be directed or undirected. In this case, they're undirected because they can go both directions, and their weights, which are these distances, represent both the distance in this example, distance from Detroit to Boston and Boston to Detroit. So it's bidirectional. Okay, so with that, we'll now talk about graph neural networks, which are more of a data science and computer science concept that are prevalent to us. So obviously, graph neural networks are represented by graphs, and they're applied in ways like maps and molecules, specifically like Google Maps uses graph neural networks to depict different to calculate ETA, and it uses different factors, which are its edges in such a manner to do so. As an example, in 2019, researchers used deep learning to find chemical compounds which could serve as antibiotics. And eventually, a previously ignored compound called halicin was actually found to be much more potent and applicable than they previously thought. And this was thanks to graph neural networks. So you can see how GNNs are very important, even in applications like chemistry, which you wouldn't necessarily connect the two together. But to talk about more of the NLP aspect of GNNs, they can be used to determine relationships between two words, and specifically the relevancy of the word to a text. And this is kind of displayed in the form of TF-IDF and PPMI, which I'll discuss in the next slide. So TF-IDF stands for term frequency inverse document frequency, and it measures how important a word is to its document. This is the formula for TF-IDF. You can interpret it as you will. But it's just important to know that it's used to calculate the relevancy of a word and to its document. PPMI is similar, but it actually measures the relevancy between two different words rather than a word and its paper. But we use the positive version of point-wise mutual information because we can't have negative relevancy. So that's why it's called PPMI, not just PMI. Okay, so the next facet of our presentation is our study on Zipf's law. And we decided to study this, even though it's an established phenomenon. We wanted to see ourselves how we could improve our own understanding. So we decided to conduct a sort of experiment on this concept rather than just take it as gospel. We wanted to try it ourselves. So to introduce this concept, I want to talk about the normal distribution, which is something many of you are probably familiar with. It's used as a measure of frequency in a GPA calculation, blood pressure, IQ, etc. There's many different applications of this, but the important thing to note for our purposes is that it doesn't apply to natural languages. So when I talk about frequency, I want you guys to throw this out the window. And on that note, I want to introduce this graph, which is a graph of the 100 most frequent words in Wikipedia. And you can see this is clearly not normal distribution, and it actually follows Zipf's law. And the definition of Zipf's law is the frequency of a token in a text is directly proportional to its rank or position in the sorted list of tokens. So what this means is that essentially the most occurring word in text will occur twice as much as the second most, 3 times as much as the third most, 4 times as much as the fourth most, and so on. So it kind of forms that negative exponential function you saw in the previous graph. And this is known as a power law function. And what this is a proportional relationship between two quantities, regardless of the initial size of either quantity. And what this means is that Zipf's law holds true for any size of text, which is very vital for our purposes since we tend to deal with varying sizes of text in our research. And this law holds true for all natural languages and other contexts, such as population distribution, data compression, and resource allocation. So it's kind of cool how, just like the normal distribution, this frequency law doesn't just hold true in one application, but also many. So to introduce the experiment we did, I'll talk about it after I show you the output, but essentially what we did was we established a base frequency, which is seen in the yellow. This is the expected Zipfian distribution for the papers we conducted. We calculated the most occurring words on, and the blue graph represents the actual data. So if I cycle through these graphs, you can see that most of them tend to follow the Zipfian distribution. And actually, this red box, I want you to pay attention to this because just note the length of the words here, because that's going to be something I touch on later. So actually, yeah, if we go back and we see also this purple box, right? It definitely differs in length significantly than many of the other graphs and their outputs. So just to discuss this, we can make 2 conclusions from this data. And the first one is that the highest ranking words are often short. And this is because speakers and writers tend to use as few unique words as possible to convey an idea. This is because it requires less thinking to do so. And as humans, we tend to go for efficiency when we're communicating our ideas. And this means we repeat words such as, the simple words in language. But what this implies is that lengthy, high-ranking words are very important to the subject matter. And this idea specifically is core to our research in NLP, because ultimately, as I'll introduce later, we want to calculate the most, we want to find what texts are about in the most efficient way possible. And so this finding is extremely important. And in this purple box, you can see, right, because tokenization ranks so highly, it seems obvious, but it tells us that that whatever the paper was, it focused primarily on tokenization just based on the frequency of the word and its occurrence. Okay, so what this analysis also tells us is that short words that occur more than long words, this can be used in text generation, because we know that word frequency also correlates with word length, so we can generate text in a Zipfian manner as well. And we also know, like as I just said, that long word frequency can be used to accurately determine topics. And this is an alternative to named entity recognition, which is a different way of establishing keyword relevancy in text, as Parth will discuss later. And another application of this analysis is in postings file compression, which is when content in a text is mapped to a table. And frequent terms are posted together, which allows the file to take up less space. So by finding the most frequent words, we can actually reduce file size as well, which is pretty interesting. So as for this experiment, we wrote all our code in Python. As I said, we created a base Zipfian distribution to compare the data graphically. We created an object class to retrieve and store the data from various research paper PDFs. And we used various Python modules, which I'll be happy to disclose later for our calculations. This is a snippet of our code. Again, I'll be happy to discuss this after the presentation. And yeah.
Okay. Now I'll be talking about named entity recognition, or NER. Okay, so NER is essentially a process used in NLP to extract information, or the most important parts of a text. So NER will find and classify named entities that it finds in the text. As you can see in the image, it sees, it highlights the named entities, which are dates, locations, organizations, people, and many more. So Wozniak and Jobs are people, so it highlights those. Apple is a company, 1976 is a date. So NER is very important to our project because it helps us understand text. NER essentially works using machine learning and tokenization by creating non-overlapping labeled spans of tokens. This is some of our code that we use, that we wrote for NER. And on the side, you can see this, I guess, like a data table. This is a CSV file that our code creates with all the named entities. And so at the top is the entity, and at the bottom is the type of entity that it is. So we wanted to test this code out by using a research paper. So we used a research paper on the Arctic Ocean and climate change. So as you can see, it tells us that it sees Arctic many times, and late summer, and OA2 and Earth. So we can assume from this that it's about climate change in the Arctic Ocean. Now I'll be talking about neurolinguistic programming, or something we recently researched. Neurolinguistic programming is a method in neuroscience which is used to find the hidden meaning behind words and human emotions and expressions. It's very important in helping people with phobias and anxiety, PTSD, or helping people calm down in stressful situations and increase productivity. It was created in the 1970s by Richard Brandler and John Greiner at UC Santa Cruz. So NLP and neurolinguistic programming are the same synonym or acronym, so I wanted to distinguish between the two. Natural language processing is essentially interaction between language and machines, and it's more technical of these two. And neurolinguistic programming is enhancement of physiological skills, and it's directly helping human health. Both NLPs will be used will be used for our project and will be vital to our work this summer.
And to discuss our work this summer, we plan to utilize all the research we did this semester to develop an NLP-SPY device, which I'll discuss in a bit. This will be Raspberry Pi based initially, because that is the most accessible form of doing this project with, and it will be open source and executable. We aim to use the NLP-based code we wrote in our open source software with this hardware to extract key components and keywords from phrases to reconstruct shortened versions of our conversations. So essentially, the reason we're creating this device is to sort of develop, we want to develop a device that can help people with memory cognition, because because NLP hasn't really been utilized in that way before. And as Parth kind of talked about in the beginning of our presentation, it's mostly been used in like to help with information accessibility and sort of like task management rather than, you know, any medical purposes. So we wanted to explore that side of NLP in our work. Also because Ms. Jahanikia is obviously a neuroscientist, and so this is a great way to utilize to kind of merge the fields. So yeah, just to discuss some of this more, although Raspberry Pi is like the most accessible and familiar way to do this, mobile app development might end up being more feasible and more accessible for more people to use. While we are exploring more alternatives to just the Raspberry Pi, we think it's a good option, but one such example of another option would be like a 3D printed listening bug. And this is just like, we've just come up with some baseline examples of what we could implement, how we could implement our ideas, but we definitely are open to feedback, and we'll be covering this much more this semester. And just to cap it off, I wanted to say, even though we've done so much research as seen by this presentation, you know, our 60 slides, we still have so much more to go. And it's really exciting to be a part of this experience and kind of just like realize that this is what research is all about, right? You feel that you've done so much, but there's always more to do. And that's why we love it.
Thank you, Neo. With that, we would like to make our final acknowledgements. First off, we would like to sincerely thank our principal investigator, Mrs. Sahar Jahanikia, for all her support and guidance that she has provided us throughout the duration of our project so far. We would also like to thank ASDRP and their efforts and support and the various opportunities that they've provided us in order to bring forth this opportunity for our team. And if you guys are interested in checking out our references, you're able to scan the QR code. And once again, thank you so much for listening, and we're open to questions. Thank you so much.
Well done, well done. I'm one proud advisor here. Well done, so much awesome work. I know how much you guys work hard on this. A lot is waiting for you guys, but I'm so happy. So yeah, so I'll just take off and answer the questions that you might have in the chat box.
Thank you.
I wonder at this point if you guys are ready to predict the contents of our next presentation. That was very well done.
Thank you.
I'm not a computer scientist, but I learned a lot. Okay. So
thank you all for your comments. Oh, sorry about that.
No, I think you all did such a good job that nobody has questions. So
I think there was actually a question for it.
Oh, there was.
It was just rushed away.
Before you mentioned you would explain your math. Oh, so yeah, we mentioned actually we explain the code. I can do that really quickly. So I think as I was discussing earlier, yeah, it was in the zip-SWA section. So yeah, just to explain this code very briefly, the way, as I explained, the way zip-SWA works is that it's like an inverse frequency graph. So the first term is expected to occur 1 over n times as much as the nth term, or sorry, the nth term is expected to occur 1 over n times as much as the first term. And that's essentially what this code is doing. So yeah, the expected term, which is the yellow graph, is expected to be the biggest frequency divided by the nth term, and which is 1 over n times the nth term. So yeah, that's what this piece of code is doing. That's how we calculate the Zipfian value. And to get the actual value, it's just a matter of pulling the frequency from code using like a Python module that allowed us to do that. So that's how we compare the two. And this is just how we graph each of our terms. Right. So we have one more question. Is our project to summarize sentences? So that was actually the initial purpose of our project when Ms. Jahanikia had taken us in. But since then, we've kind of evolved as a group. And now we're trying to focus more on how we can like process larger conversations and use like this idea of like recognizing the most important terms in a conversation to help people with like memory cognition. And that's something we're going to be exploring a lot more in depth this semester, especially specifically with the Raspberry Pi and other possible alternatives as I described in the future works. So yeah. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Okay, so just to remind everyone, we have an attendance form going up after the second presentation. That was really good. Everything has to circle back to the Jahanikia Neuro Lab. So my camera decided to not work today, but it is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker of the evening, Pratyush Singh, who started in ASDRP after his sophomore year of high school. And has been here ever since. Now he's a rising senior at American High School. And I've had the pleasure of having this young man in my group for, I guess, over a year now, where he works on some of the most complicated chemical synthesis problems there are. So Pratyush, take it away.
Thank you. All right. So today I will have the pleasure, sorry about that. I'll have the pleasure to talk about my work in which we use Benchtop NMR to gain mechanistic insight into the Biginelli condensation in order to synthesize novel trifluorinated pyrimidine compounds, more specifically monastrol. So to start off, I'd just like to give an outline of what I'm going to discuss. First, I'm going to be discussing multi-component reactions and how they contribute towards drug discovery. And then I'm going to talk about the discovery of 2,4-substituted dihydropyrimidines and monastrol. Finally, I'm going to be talking about the role of fluorination in organic synthesis and how we are progressing towards synthesis of trifluoromonastrol, and then discuss the role of 19F kinetic guided reaction mechanism elucidation and Hammett linear free energy relationships in our research. And finally, our acknowledgements and future directions. So to start it off, I just want to talk about the role of compound library generation in drug discovery science. Many molecules are chosen to be researched, but very few of the ones actually screened and discovered even make it to the preclinical stage, resulting in drug discovery and chemical synthesis being a very time-consuming, inefficient process. And how is this issue addressed? Well, this is addressed through combinatorial chemistry, which mainly helps reduce the amount of time and the amount of resources needed to overcome these issues. How combinatorial chemistry works is that a molecule is broken up into specific parts, which are then put back together to form a wide variety of analogs in one reaction platform, therefore allowing for one reaction mechanism in a small variety of parts to form a wide range of products. Typically, a reaction results in one molecule being formed for each process. However, through multi-component reactions, one reaction process can be used to create a wide range of molecules because each of the reagents used as part of the multi-component reaction can be substituted in a variety of ways, therefore giving the widest range of molecules. Here is an example of some of the most widely used multi-component reactions, more specifically the Biginelli multi-component reaction, which we will be focusing on, the Manish multi-component reaction, the Cernini reaction, and the Uji reaction. As I mentioned before, Multi-component reactions allow for one diversifiable platform, which gives a wide variety of structural possibilities. And since they require fewer steps in order to create each of these possibilities, it allows for much less waste to be produced, making it an effective way of achieving green chemistry. The Biginelli multi-component reaction is what we'll be talking about because it is the main reaction used to synthesize dihydropyrimidines for our reaction, menastrol. Menastrol is a potent mitosis inhibitor, as it inhibits the condensation EG5, therefore stopping metaphase from occurring and ruining the mitosis process. Menastrol was discovered by two scientists at Harvard Medical School, Tim Mitchison and Stuart Schreiber. And as I mentioned before, it inhibits condensation EG5, and you can see its binding sites on the screen right there. Now, I'd like to talk about the role of fluorination in medicinal chemistry. Nature uses a very small range of elements to create a wide range of molecules, more specifically carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. However, we like to add fluorine, and in recent years, many medicinal chemists have also done the same. Why exactly? Well, the easy answer is that fluorine is a very similarly sized element to hydrogen, making it very easy to substitute it in for hydrogen chemically. However, there's more. Since fluorine is bi-orthogonal and therefore not present in nature, it allows us to get an entirely brand new set of medical properties which nature could not access before. In addition, due to the fact that it produces very strong bonds with carbon, it increases the metabolic stability of small molecules, therefore increasing their lifespan before decomposition. Finally, because fluorine is much more electronegative than almost every other atom on the periodic table, it therefore alters the polarness of the molecules most drastically, therefore giving a very different electrochemical set of properties. On the right is a bunch of fluorinated small molecules that have been recently synthesized, which have shown to be effective medical agents for a wide range of targets, including cancer, microbes, bacteria, and fungus. However, what we're specifically focusing on for our project is, can we install fluorine on menastrol scaffold, and how will fluorinating this small molecule affect its anti-cancer properties? As part of our studies, we're focusing on fluorinating menastrol and an analog of it known as LASOM63, which inhibits ecto-5 nucleotides/CD73 activity, which induces apoptosis. You can see LASOM63 on the screen, and it's simply an N-dimethyl group attached onto the benzaldehyde. As I mentioned before, the Biginelli cycle condensation is what's used, and the reaction uses a substitute benzaldehyde, a urea, and an acetoacetate alongside a Lewis acid catalyst to create dihydropyrimidines. The reaction has three possible routes: the Minium route, the Nova-Nagel route, the Enum route, which I will later be covering in greater detail. In addition, for the purposes of our experiment, we used ytterbium triflate in order to catalyze the reaction, although we did test a wide range of catalysts, which I will later be talking about. So, as I mentioned, part of the stuff we wanted to test was fluorinating the scaffold of menastrol. And in order to achieve this, we simply substituted ethyl acetoacetate with trifluorinated ethyl acetoacetate, thus attaching a fluorine handle to our molecule. However, when we went through the synthetic route to achieve this molecule, we found that we were not synthesizing dehydrogen menastrol as we intended to. Instead, we found that we were forming a hydrated version of this dihydropyrimidine. On the screen, you can see how there is a doublet at the 4.5 to 4.7 range. While this may not seem special, it was supposed to be a singlet, and thus we learned that we had another hydrogen at this point, which we eventually found to be an alcohol. Thus, we learned that trifluorinated dihydropyrimidines did not undergo dehydration unless they were forced to. We further confirmed this through more NMR studies. However, through rigorous screening of multiple conditions, we found that in strongly acidic conditions, we were able to force dehydration, which you can see in the conditions we tested below. Majority of them failed, however, until we tested a reaction done in 10 equivalencies of prussic acid in toluene, which was refluxed to 100 degrees Celsius, which ultimately give us 50% yield of our dehydration reaction. Now that we had successfully synthesized manastrol, we moved on to focus on our mechanistic studies and how the trifluorinated reaction works. As I mentioned before, the Biginelli cycle condensation goes through 3 routes. I'll be discussing each of them here. The first route is the minimum route, which is a reaction between thiourea and a substitute of benzaldehyde, and its resulting intermediate reacts in the ethyl acetoacetate. On the screen, I have circled on this, and box various substitutions to show how you would either fluorinate or substitute analogs. The second route is the Enneman route. In this one, thiourea and ethyl acetoacetate react first, and then this intermediate reacts with our substitute benzaldehyde. As you can see, for the purpose of just drawing, we've used benzaldehyde with the alcohol in the 3 position, but this substitution will be widely changed as part of our studies later on. And in addition, we did use ethyl acetoacetate, but for the purposes of our studies, we focus on using trifluorinated ethyl acetoacetate. Final route is Novanagle, in which a substitute of benzaldehyde and ethyl acetoacetate react first. The resulting intermediate reacts with thiourea. So the first thing we focused on setting out was deciding which of the 3 mechanisms trifluorinated manastrol was synthesized by. In order to do this, we performed 3 experiments where we added both of the reagents for the mechanism, and in each case, this would be a different combination such as ethyl acetoacetate and thiourea, or thiourea and the substitute benzaldehyde, in order to form the intermediate first, and then added the 3rd reagent at the end of this to react with the intermediate formed in order to produce manastrol. Once we had integrated each of these NMRs, we were able to determine that enamine had produced the most product, thus causing us to believe that the enamine mechanism was the most favored because it produced the most product. On the screen, you can see the many NMRs we took for each of them, and we have attributed each of the fluorine peaks, as we did this in 19F, to each of the fluorine handles attached to various things we've created. However, once we had figured out the enamine was the favored reaction, we wanted to learn more about the variety of other optimized conditions we could do to improve the yield of our reaction. So the first thing we tested was what catalyze we would use. In a paper, we found that lanthanum chloride was supposed to be more effective as a catalyst for this reaction due to the fact that we used thiourea. And while this was true, as it gave us 7% improved yield over ytterbium triflate, lanthanum chloride was too inefficient as it had very poor solubility in our solvent of choice, acetonitrile, and thus we chose to stick with ytterbium triflate. We also tested scandium and indium triflate as catalysts. However, both of these catalysts proved to be widely inefficient as they produce many side products and give very minimal conversion. In addition, we also tested a wide range of reaction concentrations, including 0.1 molar, 0.75 molar, and 1 molar. And ultimately, we found that as the reaction concentration increased, the yield increased. We believe that this is due to the product of the reaction crashing out, thus pushing the reaction forward as there was less equilibrium issues. The final mechanism in optimized condition we test was the concentration of our catalyst. We loaded ytterbium into our reaction at a variety of ranges, from 2% to 14%. And upon integrating each of these yields to an internal standard, which we use trifluorotoluene for, we found that 8% had by far the largest yield, although, and while we believe that there may have been some fluctuations due to various issues with the reactions varying, we ultimately decided that 8% was the most effective. Now, I'd like to talk about our main project and what we've been building towards by optimizing our reaction so much. What we intend to do is we intend to synthesize a wide variety of molecules, or manastrol specifically, a variety of substitutions on the benzaldehyde, ranging from electron withdrawing characteristics to electron donating characteristics, as shown on screen. Thus, we intend to make a linear free energy relationship, or a Hammett clock. As what we want to do is we want to see how the electron donating and electron withdrawing effects affect the equilibrium of the reaction. If a more electron donating substituent drives the reaction forward, obviously the equilibrium would be different, thus giving a more effective yield. And we want to graph that against the various effects. So on the screen, I've showed a couple of the pKa values of the various substituents that we tested, such as nitros and cyanos. and we wanted to test whether or not there is a relationship between aryl substitutions and pKa, which there is. And we found that the more electron donating, the less stable that anionic charge and the higher the pKa. And the same vice versa for electron withdrawing. Okay, and thus we plan on creating a relationship between Hammett effects. And while we have yet to create a full set of data, we do have some preliminary information, which I will later be addressing. So you can see here a couple of the ranges in which we've got the reaction rate on the x-axis and the Hammett values of the substituents on the y-axis. On the right of the screen, you can see the various para and meta values or Hammett values of each of the substituents. And once we graphed the reaction rates of each of the substituents against their Hammett values, we were able to form a graph that shows that as the Hammett value increases, the reaction rate also increases. And how do we achieve this rate? By doing this, we did 19F kinetic studies. Basically, we ran a reaction of the synthesis of each of these analogs in an NMR tube for 3 hours. And we took an NMR scan every 30 minutes. We did this in 19F due to the fact that we attached a fluorine handle on our final molecule and the ethyl acetoacetate. And by determining how much the ethyl acetoacetate had been consumed and the amount of the peak we believed to be product had increased, we were able to determine the rate of production for our molecule by averaging the rate of formation of product and the rate of consumption of ethyl acetoacetate. Sorry. Through the use of 19F NMR, we were able to understand how various substituents affect the electronic stability of our final molecule, the rate of our reaction. And in the future, we intend to do more studies and to build the rest of our analog library and get more biological data on how these substituents affect the medical activity through a wide range of biological assays. That finishes the entirety of our study. And I'd like to say some acknowledgements and thank my mentor, Edward New, my various crewmates, and ASDRP and for giving me the opportunity. In addition, I'd like to give a shout out to Analysis, which offered Benchtop NMRs to ASDRP, which have been integral to the research we've done. Thank you.
Great job, Pratoosh. Does anybody have questions?
No, I'm not by myself in this project. We have a couple of other group mates. Never mind. That question is for the people who present before me. If any of you would like to address the question.
So, Pratoosh, I'll ask you a question as your advisor. You've worked on a number of different medicinal chemistry projects, first with Scott Clark and then more recently in our group.
Yep.
How has your perspective of synthesis changed, or has it stayed the same over the course of your time working on different projects? Like, what was the biggest takeaway that you think has grown on you over the course of these different projects?
So there definitely has been a change in my perspective. And at the beginning, chemical synthesis seemed to be more so focused on achieving medicinally effective molecules, with everything else being sort of set aside because I was focusing more on the biological implications of the molecules I was creating. However, after experiencing a large variety of groups, and especially this group, I found that a lot of chemical research is also importantly focusing on optimizing synthesis, because as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of the research that's done is ultimately inefficient, meaning that what we have to achieve is finding a way to make a wide range of molecules as effectively as possible. And so I feel that in addition to biochemical research, there is a very important need for other branches such as physical chemistry and reaction methods chemistry, like I'm working on in this project, because it ultimately optimizes the goal of chemistry as a field in the end, which is obviously to make a wide range of useful molecules, whether that be for biological purposes or material purposes.
Very well stated. I couldn't have said it better myself. Okay. Any other questions for, I guess now you're referred to as Mr. Singh?
Yeah.
There is a question for the previous, for Sahar's group, if Sahar or others want to respond to that. Oh, and then there's a question here for Pratoosh.
So do tell me if I'm misinterpreting your question. So basically, we didn't have to specifically combine them in any specific way. As I mentioned, we use a Biginelli cycle condensation as a reaction to combine them. And so
what? It'll be our dance.
Oh, yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
sorry, Lorelei, you seem to have your mic unmuted.
Yeah, let's do it. Oh,
Keep on going, Pratoosh. Just keep on going.
All right. Yeah, so we simply had to use the reagents as needed. And in order to create the analog we intended to create, we simply substituted various moieties at different parts. So specifically for that acetoacetate, we fluorinated the methyl on the left. And on the benzaldehyde, we simply added a substituent at whether or not that be the para or meta position. So we didn't actually have to do any specific methods. We simply had to choose the reagents we needed to use to create what we wanted to make. Yeah, I'm sorry if that didn't answer. You can feel free to give a follow-up question if you need it.
I would like to address the question that was asked to the NLP team regarding, if I were to reiterate the question was, see here. How would you respond to claims that, to a claim that neurolinguistics programming or NLP is a pseudoscience? So after reading a little bit about this earlier, we found out that like neurolinguistic programming is essentially more of like a framework and more of like a life-changing framework, and it's kind of like an operating system that can be used to set, you know, certain meaningful outcomes, you know, set powerful beliefs, get rid of bad memories, phobias, and other things like that. So it really doesn't matter whether it can be considered like a pseudoscience or not, but a lot of different researchers do believe that it is a pseudoscientific like approach to communication, personal development, or any other sort of psychotherapy that is in recent years. So hopefully that answers your question.
Hi. So Zena asked me a question. And so basically the main importance of the Hammett linear free energy studies that we're doing is basically we wanted to figure out how electron donating or electron withdrawing from the aryl region of benzaldehyde could affect the rate of the reaction. And this actually has given us great insight into the mechanism of the Biginelli, because I don't know if you guys completely remember the mechanism that I showed before, but the synthesis of non-fluorinated monastrol typically goes through the Novonagel route, unlike the Eman route, which I said we discovered for our synthesis of trifluorinated monastrol. And thus, we've discovered that by adding an electronegative molecule which draws electrons away from the main constituents, you're able to change how the Biginelli works. And we believe that in part, this also has to do with the addition of different substitutions on the benzaldehyde, because by changing electrochemical properties of the benzaldehyde, you're able to change the overall mechanism. In addition, we've noticed that as you give a more electron donating group, the reaction rate greatly increases, showing us the positive correlation you saw on the Hammett free energy relationship. Ultimately, the main insight we're trying to get isn't anything about the reaction itself, but just about how you could simply make the reaction move further and faster. So for Isha, we have, as I said before, I don't know if I may have not gotten this properly across. We actually haven't done any biological assays for this group. That's simply a future project we plan on doing. For now, we're finishing up the synthesis of all of the analogs we intend to create and getting their scale-ups. Oh, so I'm not sure if there's been no studies at all on the benefits of adding fluorine to NaCl, but this is the first study on its effect on the synthetic route of the Biginelli. There's been no other work into how fluorines can affect the route, such as how it was novel for us to discover that fluorinated NaCl is done through the enamine mechanism instead of the Novenagel one. That had never been shown in any papers before. Sorry if I'm just going through your questions quite fast. I just don't want to take too much time up now that we're going a little over time.
Okay, and to answer that question more fully, there have been fluorinated dihydropyrimidines, but those are generally ring fluorinated. These compounds most of them are novel. Some of them have been made before by others, but this is the first systematic mechanistic study, as Proteus is indicated. Okay. All right, Harsha has a question for Mr. Singh.
Honestly, if I had to say what the challenges are, in general, I would say there is much of a challenge, but obviously in our case, due to the fact that we focus on the methods of the Biginelli cycle condensation, simply having an additional reagent to work with meant that there were so many more possible avenues for how our reaction would progress, which just meant that we had to screen more conditions and more possibilities as part of our research. All right, seems like there's no more questions left.
All right. So there's no other questions. Make sure you guys saw the attendance form. That was awesome. We got, Sahara is now telling me that we were gifted with knowledge. Yeah, I thought those are two excellent presentations. We'll see you all next Tuesday evening for the next rendition of Colloquium Tuesdays. Have a good night, everyone.